Always document what you've done in terms of your methodology around determining how you're going to use your information to determine what sex someone is.
Gender pay gap sort of calculations, there's not going to be a one size fits all for that. It is going to vary. At the moment, it looks like each individual country will have its own definitions, its own methodology that you'll need to follow.
I think the level of work involved wasn't anticipated. Actually, it's a huge project. A lot of legacy stuff will likely come out. So it is really, really important to just make sure that the journey and the audit process is in there.
Keeping businesses thriving, compliance and safe, forecasting strategy, it's all on our mind. It's time payroll took its place in the boardroom to shine.
Deal is the global payroll platform built for complexity. From payslips to benefits to compliance in over 150 countries. Deal centralizes everything in one secure workflow with real-time visibility across your entire workforce. No fragmented systems, no chasing local vendors, just accurate, compliant pay delivered on time, every time. See why more than 35,000 businesses trust Deal. Visit DEEL.com/nickday to book your demo. That's DEEL.com/nickday. Hello and welcome back to the Payroll Podcast, where we explore the ideas, the insights and innovations shaping the global payroll profession. Now, today's episode is a little bit different, but it's incredibly timely. We're sharing a special live panel discussion featuring 4 leading experts from across reward, law, and pay transparency. This session was hosted as part of a collaborative event delivered with Reward Strategy, JGA Recruitment Group, and my senior reward leaders community. Now, with the EU Pay Transparency Directive approaching fast, many organisations are still unclear about what the legislation truly requires, what deadlines matter, and how to prepare operationally. That's why today's panel brings together multiple perspectives to provide clarity, direction, and practical guidance. Now, if you're new to the show at the Payroll Podcast, let me just say welcome. My name is Nick Day. I'm the host of this show. If you're new to the show, please do remember to click subscribe, or if you're watching us on YouTube, remember to click follow below. If you could also leave us a 5-star review, that would be great. But most importantly, share this episode with your colleagues and friends so we can really raise the profile of payroll worldwide. Now, back in today's special episode. Your panelists for this session are Daniela McGuigan, Partner and Employment Law Specialist, Stuart Hyland, EU Pay Transparency Consultant, John Diamond, Head of Reward at MKS, and Sally Elcombe, former Big Four consultant and best-selling author on reward strategy. Now, across this 60-minute conversation, our experts are going to unpack what the directive actually demands, legal obligations and timelines organisations must meet, a practical roadmap for implementation, operational checklists you can use straight away, risk mitigation strategies that reduce organisational exposure, and sector-by-sector insights into what's working and what is not. This is not a compliance lecture, so don't worry. It's an actionable, insight-led discussion designed to help payroll and reward leaders prepare with confidence. It's facilitated by Lewis Roskilly, who's the head of our recruitment reward division here at JGA Recruitment. It's a really, really lively and exciting conversation. So let's drop in to the live panel. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Lewis Roskilly, Global Reward Lead at JGA Recruitment. We specialise in global recruitment across rewards, payroll and HR. And I spend most of my time speaking to reward leaders or future stars about their careers and expertise, with the goal of matching them with the right business, investing in their total reward strategy, and love partnering with organisations that are always thinking ahead of the curve rather than trying to chase it. So alongside my role at JGA, I also run a senior reward leaders community. It's a network of professionals who are shaping where reward is heading. We share ideas, pressure test strategy, and are really honest about what's working and what's not. And that spirit of discussion is exactly what today is also all about. The EU Pay Transparency Directive is getting closer, and while the headlines feels simple. The reality for you all is anything but. Many organisations are slightly behind pace, unsure what's required, and juggling legal, operational, and culture considerations all at once. So the aim of today's conversation is to bring clarity from multiple angles. And hopefully by the end of the session, you should walk away with a stronger grasp of your legal obligations, timelines, a practical roadmap, an operational checklist, and a sense of where risk sits and how to mitigate it, and what's landing well across sectors. Most importantly, we want to spark action. Pay transparency isn't just about compliance. It's reshaping how organizations build trust, how reward is understood, and how these systems are embedded. I'm lucky to be joined by was 4, but now 3 brilliant panelists who will bring legal, operational, strategic, and overall professional insights. I'll allow each of them to introduce themselves, and then we'll jump straight into the webinar. So I'll start with Daniela.
Thank you, Lewis. Good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here to talk about this exciting, in inverted commas, topic with you all. So my name's Daniela McGuigan. I'm an employment lawyer with the law firm Ogletree Deakins. So I do all types of employment law, but I have a particular interest in all things sort of gender pay gap related, primarily because in my previous firm, I spent years and years defending mass litigation that was being brought against the NHS, so the public sector, which I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with. So that sort of sparked my interest. And then when the EU Pay Transparency Directive came around, that falls squarely within my sort of area of interest too. So really look forward to discussing this in further detail with you this morning.
Stuart?
Good morning, everyone. Stuart Hyland from Ellison. We're a small sort of specialist reward advisory business based out of London, but we work with employers around the world. I've been working in reward consulting, reward advisory for nearly 30 years now. This is the single biggest piece of change that I've seen in my career, and it's moving all the time, evolving all the time. I think this is the 6th or 7th speaking engagement that I've sort of participated in the last month. And in preparing for today, I went back over some of my notes from the earlier sessions. They're all out of date. So it's a really fast moving area, and I'm delighted to be joining you today and talking about the work we do with our clients and the advice that we're giving to employers at the moment.
Awesome. And lastly, Sally.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Oldcombe. I head up the reward services for Moore Kingston Smith, but I work within the HR consultancy arm of Moore Kingston Smith. Moore Kingston Smith are a global consultancy, finance and legal consultancy firm. So, as Stuart has said, sort of EU Pay Transparency and all of those connected bits are becoming really, really paramount now. Working with clients, not just outside of the UK, but within the UK, who are, really looking to do something. And in particular, within the UK, there's a lot of movement around what can we do, how can we improve what we do, and we don't want to lag behind. So this webinar, I think, is the start of many, I suspect. And as Stuart sort of said, he's already been on a fair few in the last month.
Perfect. So let's dive into some content. So Daniela, from a legal side of things, how can organisations meet reporting requirements in jurisdictions where gender disclosure is not mandatory, and what practical or legal solutions are emerging?
Yeah, well, I think as I'm going to keep quoting you, Stuart, at the minute. As Stuart said, this is a really fast moving area. And I think, so I'm coming at this from as Lewis said, I'm an employment lawyer, so I'm coming at it from a legal perspective. And there may be operational wiggle room there, but legally speaking, there's no requirement under the directive that requires workers to disclose whether they're male or female. Now, when this all rolls out, we could get 27 versions of the directive, because as you know, the directive sits as a piece of umbrella. If you think of it as a big umbrella sitting over the top of all of the 27 member countries, which states the minimum requirements. But when each individual member state transposes the requirements of the directive into their national law, there's absolutely nothing to stop them going above and beyond the minimum requirements of the directive. They can't do less, but they can do more. So everything that I say today is sort of caveated with, I'm basing it on what the directive says, but when it gets brought into national law, that will take precedence. So if there's something more prescriptive when each member state makes an announcement, that will be what you should follow legally. But just on a practical point of view, there is no requirement to disclose your sex. So it is down to what each member state says around that. However, the directive is quite helpful because if you've taken the time to sort of read the legislation, you'll know that the sort of legal bit is bolted onto the end and there's lots of paragraphs, introductory, helpful guidance paragraphs at the start of the directive's written sort of framework. And recommendation 40 of the directive refers to acknowledging that employers might lack the data that they need to do some of this reporting. So what it recommends, and this is a practical workaround, is that where you already hold that information, so if you already hold information around people's gender, for example, it could be within national administrative information, sort of tax, social security, other state registers that you use to do basic computations, for example, within payroll, you can use that data that you already hold if it identifies the sex of an individual, and you wouldn't need further consent to use that information. You could use it for these purposes. Taking it to the UK, for those of you familiar with the UK gender pay gap regulations, you'll know that that just basically says, if in doubt, leave them out. So if you don't know the sex, you don't have to include them in the calculations, which is, you've got to kind of take your best stab at trying to get that information. But ultimately, if you're not sure, you just leave them out of the calculations. And I would imagine that the same principle will follow when each member state sort of makes their more prescriptive announcements. Just some sort of practical workarounds, I would say, is always document what you've done in terms of your methodology around determining how you're going to use your information to determine what sex someone is. So, for example, if you are going to rely on social security information or the equivalent in each member state, just make a note that that's what you've done, just so it's there if there's ever a challenge. If you've got workers' representatives, for example, they're going to want to know what methodology you've applied to make that determination. So it's just important that you keep that audit trail to help. You know, you might look at this in a few years' time and forget what you actually did. It's amazing how that can happen, particularly if ever there's litigation further down the line. You want that corporate memory to remind you of, what did we do? People come and go from organisations, so you just need to remind yourself, how did we work that out at the time? So yeah, there's no defined way of approaching this, Lewis. That's as much as the directive says at the moment. I think it's quite a sensible view, and different countries have different methodology of how they hold gender data within their system. So some will do it more prescriptively than others, so there will be a variation across the 27 member states. There's no doubt about that, but that's what the directive says, and that would certainly be my recommendation from a legal perspective at this stage.
That's really helpful context, and building on that, it raises an important point around how roles are actually evaluated. So when courts assess equal work or work of equal value, how much weight do they place on the written job description versus the reality of day-to-day duties?
Yeah, okay. So again, I want to make the distinction about litigation and job evaluation. So by the time you're in court, the wheels have already come off and there's a legal challenge on whatever you've done. So relations have probably broken down. You're in a court environment and litigation is on its way. So it's a different approach that you will take when you've got to that stage than you might take at this early preparatory stage. And so I would say that the documentation that you might want to rely on now, the gold standard, and I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will echo this, the gold standard for getting this kind of preparatory work in place would be a full-scale proper job evaluation study of every job in an organisation. They're all evaluated, they're all assessed, and it's all wonderful. The reality is that's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, and there's a lot we don't know yet in the directive. There is an expectation built into the directive that each individual member state will produce some guidance on what it expects employers to follow when they're determining whether two roles are of equal value or not. So again, we are waiting for that prescriptive guidance around the methodology to be followed to determine whether two jobs are of equal value or not. That may well give you some help in terms of how prescriptive a job description is going to need to be around those four factors that we know that are built into the directives. That's the skills, effort, working conditions, and responsibility. We know that the directive is focusing on those four things around equal value. But to go back to your original question, Lewis, about job descriptions. So in a job evaluation type exercise, people use all sorts of tools. They have job profile libraries. They try and match roles to existing job profiles, job families. It very much depends on your own existing job architecture within your organisation, and that may also vary country by country as well. It could vary hugely across organisations. When you get to litigation, and I'm basing this primarily on my experience in the UK. As I mentioned in my intro, I did a lot of litigation, public sector litigation, where I was defending NHS trusts against equal pay claims. They were the types of claims where you've got male-dominated jobs, such as a porter, that were paid more than female-dominated jobs, such as a healthcare assistant. So completely different jobs we're comparing. When you get to that litigation, forget your job descriptions that you might issue when someone starts a role. Those little 3 pages on the back where it kind of gives you a very high level summary. You kind of annex it sometimes as Appendix 1 to an employment contract, and everybody feels nice and warm and cozy, and that's your job description. The reality is, one, jobs evolve and job descriptions are very rarely updated unless someone's promoted or moves jobs entirely. And two, they're just a summary. They do not go into the level of detail whatsoever that you need to go into when you're doing a proper equal value comparison. So once you get to litigation, I'm afraid it is absolutely what the job holder does in practice. Forget what your job description says. The job holders, so the individual who's bringing the claim, will be interviewed at length, ad nauseum, about what they do day to day in their job. And when I say at length, we're talking about 100-page job descriptions. That's the level of detail that you're going into. And they are assessed with a highly skilled independent expert. And the same for the comparator, whoever the comparator might be that's identified in that legal challenge. And then they're properly compared and assessed against those factors. There's only 4 in the directive. I mean, my experience is there's normally many more than 4 factors. When you're looking at equal value, it goes above and beyond 4. Again, we'll see what each member state says around that. They may well say, we want to go beyond 4. But we know the minimum's 4 in the directive so far. But it really is an ad nauseum task to kind of go through those job descriptions. Now, I'm not saying for a moment, those of you may feel a little bit queasy at the thought of, what? Please tell me she's not saying we've now got to do 100-page job descriptions. Of course I'm not. But you're asking me about litigation, so I'm giving you the worst case scenario. And it's important to bear that in mind, because everything you're doing now is to prevent you getting to that point. So it's a balance. It's a practical balance about doing enough where you feel comfortable that you've got, because the reason you're looking at equal value is categorizing your workers, because those two words, equal value, is what's creating the biggest amount of work in this directive. You're grouping your workers, those that are doing the same or identical jobs. That's fairly straightforward. You probably know who those people are and what those groups are. But then you have to look across your organization where you're comparing people who do nothing like each other, but you're taking your best kind of a guess to start with at where there's an equivalence of value in terms of the demands on that person in the work that they do. So that's a different sort of exercise, but I'll let my colleagues talk more about that, because that's more their area of expertise. But it's a different. You've got to kind of take a pragmatic view, but do enough that it's meaningful. But it certainly wouldn't be 100-page job description that you would end up producing if litigation followed. So there's a balance to be struck, really. But you should bear in mind that if it got to litigation, the job holders will be interviewed. So you can't just make something up on a piece of paper if it bears no resemblance to what the actual job holders are doing in their day-to-day lives. It's got to be meaningful and realistic. And some people do interview job holders within the organisation when they're putting these profiles together. That's great. That is the gold standard. But it doesn't happen everywhere for practical reasons and all sorts of other reasons. But yeah, that's where it sits from a legal perspective and what would be looked at once it gets to the litigation stage. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Daniela. And I think that context sets us up perfectly to kind of zoom out and look at the wider EU picture. So let me bring Stuart in. Stuart, is every country on track for a June 7th, 2026 go live of the regulations?
Short answer, no, probably not. It is a mixed picture, though, that the majority are tracking okay. It looks like they're going to be okay. But if we think about those where delays are expected or are being sort of considered, I suspect everyone on the call knows what's going on in the Netherlands. In September, actually, the Dutch were one of the early movers. They produced a draft back in May time, so very much sort of one of the early movers on this. But the government announced in September that it was requesting or would be delaying the June 7th deadline for 6 months, and it would come into effect just after the new year 2027. No delay on the reporting side, the gender pay gap piece, just that first deadline. But there was an election in the Netherlands about 3 weeks ago, and the centre-left party gained dominance. And that's pretty significant if you have an operation in the Netherlands, because one of the lead negotiators, there were two lead negotiators in the EU around this directive. One of them was a member of that centre-left party. They are massive supporters of it. I was in Amsterdam when the election results were coming through at a conference there, and there was a strong expectation that if they could get the government organised quickly, i.e. this side of Christmas, that there was an expectation that the delay would be cancelled in January and that they would push ahead. So if you've got people in the Netherlands, keep an eye on that, because things are likely to move there in either direction. We just don't know yet. Ireland might be a delay in Ireland. They announced their sort of parliamentary agenda for the coming 12 months back in September. There's about 140 items or bills on that announcement, and they've prioritised them into 3 tiers. The top priority tier has got 25 items on it. The same with the second priority, with the other 80, 90 all coming into tier 3. And that's where the pay transparency regulation is sitting currently. Again, it could change tomorrow, but if they stick to that prioritization, it will raise questions about how quickly they can work through that sort of list and get around to it. Croatia, they're sort of talking in Croatia about delaying until September. Hungary, they're thinking there may be some delays. But just as an interesting sort of case study, there was a fairly strong expectation that Germany would be delaying because of the time it takes things to move through their process. But in the last few weeks, there's been an awful lot of progress, and all of a sudden now it looks like they're back on track and that we will get some clarity and some regulations through in advance of June. So things can change really quickly. I say it is a more positive picture elsewhere. Poland, we know that the recruitment piece comes into effect from December the 24th. Merry Christmas, everyone in Poland. Great day to introduce a new set of regulations. But also then everything else, that was just the recruitment piece. Everything else there had been radio silence on, and there was a bit of frustration amongst employers there that they hadn't heard anything else about when the rest of the requirements would come into effect. There was a paper published last week, and we're expecting the draft regulation any day now. So again, things have changed very, very recently in Poland. We know Belgium and Malta have got some clarity around certain things, and they're moving ahead. By the end of this year, we expect to have further announcements from Cyprus, Lithuania, Belgium with the rest of its requirements, Latvia. In Finland, the draft law is available and it's going in front, or expected to go in front of their parliament this month for sign off. January, we're expecting to have Sweden, Denmark, and probably France also coming in with a lot more details. Spain, Portugal, Italy as the other major markets. It's still fairly quiet. We haven't got a lot of information there, but work is known to be underway. What I would say, though, is even if you are in a market where there is a delay, that doesn't mean you as the employer should delay either, and don't think you're off the hook and you've necessarily got an extension there. Employees under EU law, employees can still rely on the directive. They can still force employers to comply with the directive in certain conditions. I think it's called sort of a direct application from a directive. So do keep an eye on that, because it is entirely possible, as I say, that something like the right to information under the pay transparency regulations could still be enforced in a country, even if that country hasn't published details of the local laws yet. So it is something to keep an eye on. Do not take that delay for granted. And please treat the June deadline as a deadline for all countries, regardless of what goes on locally. You don't want to be the test case. I'm sure Daniela would agree with that. The trick here is to stay ahead of the game and do not be the test case for any of these laws.
And given that there is mixed progress, and a key challenge for multinationals is consistency, what advice would you give an employer with a presence in multiple EU countries? Is there a single approach to transparency that could be used across the region?
The biggest piece of advice, starting with the first part of that question, the biggest piece of advice is don't wait. Please own the conversation, get it moving, ensure you are ready. And when we think about being ready, there's probably a number of different aspects to that we can have a look at. But I think in terms of the single approach piece, when it comes to reporting, the gender pay gap sort of calculations, there's not going to be a one size fits all for that. It is going to vary. At the moment, it looks like each individual country will have its own definitions, its own methodology that you'll need to follow. So it's not going to be possible, unfortunately, to have a single organisation-wide gender pay gap reporting approach. However, on some of the wider requirements, you can be more consistent. So something like grading and job architecture, the use of a job evaluation tool, you can do that across the whole of the region. You can have a single methodology. In fact, it's simpler if you do. You don't need to have lots of local variations on that, because the definition of equal work of equal value is consistent. So that you can apply and you can use sort of across your business. There are some other areas where you can also have a single approach. Something like recruitment, you can have a single approach, a single recruitment policy, but you may just need to allow for a little bit of local flexibility. For example, when it comes to the requirement to share information with candidates about the salary or salary range for the role that they're applying for, there are different requirements in different parts of the EU already coming through. So in Ireland, when they published some outline on that, they were very specific that it went into the job description into the job advert at the point of advertising for that role. In Poland, those requirements that come into effect in December give you more flexibility, and the requirement there is not necessarily that different to where they are now, because you just have to give that information before any employment contract is sort of shared or signed. So you need to allow some flexibility of the local elements and local components to make sure it's competitive in those individual markets, but you can still operate with a single coherent sort of international framework. How pay ranges are developed, yes, there will be different quantum and different numbers involved, but again, you can link them to market data. You can talk about the process, the structure in a consistent way. So you can have these areas of consistency. You can have a single approach to incentive plans. Again, you might have different quantum and slightly different metrics, but you can have the same principles rewarding for the same things. But you do need to allow for that area of local adjustment, local scope. So lots of opportunity there. It's one of the reasons why, if you haven't done it already, I would recommend you consider adding a piece on sort of pay transparency strategy into your core reward strategy document, just so you've got that set out, it's documented, it's recorded in terms of the principles and the underlying ethos that you're trying to deliver to the business. I think a couple of other just very quick pieces of advice for international employers. Stay in touch with developments. There are things changing and shifting all the time. There is a big debate across the EU at the moment about how you define category of worker when it comes to pay reporting. Is it all work of equal value? Can you allow variation by job family, and so on? So there is a debate around that at the moment. There's no single clear output or view on that. There are some variations. And then the final piece, and perhaps the most important piece of advice I would give, is please talk to others, talk to advisors in the space. Do not rely on searching the internet or using ChatGPT. Other AI providers are available, because the data that they're presenting you with is often out of date and it's incorrect. There's a lot of really, really bad advice out there online that has been downloaded. And when you go into some of these engines and ask it a question, it doesn't differentiate. It draws on bad advice as well as good. So please, please talk to people. Do not rely on, as I say, internet searches or a simple AI question and all the answers that come from that. It may be correct, but there is a good chance that the answer will have been infected with some bad advice somewhere along the line.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stuart.
Attention payroll leaders, if you're listening to this, you already know that payroll has never been more complex. Compliance risks are rising, skilled talent is scarce, and getting it wrong can cost your business way more than just money. It can cost you trust, retention, and of course, brand reputation. I'm Nick Day, host of this show and also CEO of JGA Recruitment Group, specialist global payroll recruiters. Here at JGA, we're so passionate about payroll, we've even turned it into music. Don't believe us? Head to your favorite audio platform and search for Payroll Powers the World, and you can quite literally join us in song about how we believe payroll deserves its moment in the boardroom to shine. At JGA, we'd like to think our passion shines through to our recruitment results as well. With a 97% retention rate and an average 19-day job brief to hire success rate, we work fast, we work strategically, and we work with purpose to connect you to the hidden payroll talent that job ads and direct search methods will simply never reach. So if you're hiring or indeed planning to hire, why not partner with the experts that are shaping the future of payroll? Partner with jgarecruitment.com today, or better yet, drop me a message directly, and together we can make sure your next payroll hire is your best one yet.
So let's shift from the regulatory landscape to the cultural side of transparency, which is where Sally comes in. So Sally, how can organisations move beyond compliance to use pay transparency as a lever for trust and engagement?
Well, compliance is always going to be the baseline. But where the change and the trust, or the trust in the change rather, comes in, is how it's embedded within culture and within values. And it's about getting those early principles right. I was at a meeting last week talking to a table of folk who were quite well into their EU Pay Transparency journey. And the theme that came through was the early prep, which sort of both Daniela and Stuart have mentioned as well, but also just about focus groups, getting the wider workforce involved in those conversations, just so that there's a real good understanding of what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we have to do, what are those immovables, within the compliance, this is what we have to do and by when. But actually, now what do we need to do to get there? And some of the messages as well was that there was so much duplication of work where some teams weren't communicating well. So what a few of them had done was actually stopped and stepped back and said, right, okay, we can't keep doing this. We need to be really working better together. Not only are we giving mixed messages amongst ourselves, but we're giving out those mixed messages to managers. We need to make sure that by the end of the day, we can give our managers all the tools that they need to go out and explain, well, why have you done this with my pay? What does it mean by pay transparency? How is my data safe? Where does this align to sort of GDPR? And, so there was a lot of concern around the security of data and personal data as well. So, for example, at Moore Kingston Smith, we have taken some really early steps in being transparent around our pay structures. And we started our journey last year. And it meant that we had to really look at what we had. Unfortunately, we found a fair few sort of gremlins. We had a number of issues around legacy agreements, legacy pay, and pay structures that meant before we could go any further, we had to actually address those first. What were we going to do about it? And it's interesting, Daniela, what you said about sort of job descriptions. We didn't quite go to the 100-page, but our job descriptions, I think robust is probably a good term that I would use for them. But it's an evolving process. What we're doing, our pay strategy, is very much a live document. So it's still growing, still evolving. Our job descriptions are really very good, but we've still got some way to go. And what we're doing as well is including the managers and the wider business in the journey. We explain just before pay review what's happened, how have our pay decisions been made, what's influenced our pay data, how have we evaluated roles, what process have we got, what scoring mechanisms do we use. And we still get challenges. I think you'll always get challenges on pay and pay structure anyway, but it has it's also allowed folk to clearly see with the pay transparencies where we've linked it to frameworks that show skills and development needed to move on, that there's that link with, oh, actually, I don't need to leave MKS to move up. I can actually sort of stay within the organisation because I can see what's needed for me to sort of keep going on. And there's a real shift in trust as well within the organisation, that we are being so open.
So once transparency becomes part of the culture, Sally, the next step is that structure that underpins it. So what practical steps have you seen reward teams take to build a clear pay architecture in anticipation of the directive?
I think, I'll start that by saying that I don't think the work involved in getting transparent pay bands and getting to a place where an organisation can say, here we go. I think the level of work involved wasn't anticipated. Actually, it's a huge project, and a lot of legacy stuff will likely come out. So what I've been seeing is clarity around roles, so refreshing job descriptions, as Daniela said, in various forms, just actually even looking at the template and going, well, is this fit for purpose? Actually, no, it's not, for where we want to be. It's looking at if there's a job family structure in place, it's tightening that job family structure, and looking at how roles are compared and just ensuring that the approach is fair and equitable. And again, sort of just going back to a comment that Daniela made about documenting the process. That's one of the things that when I'm working with clients is that we are making sure, and it's one of the points that I'm putting into the pay strategy documents, is documenting everything all the way through, because I'm not going to be there forever, and the reward teams that I might be working with could move around. So it is really, really important to just make sure that the journey and the audit process is in there. And it's also looking at the systems that are being used, the HR systems. I'm not the only one. Often a HR system doesn't read a payroll system, doesn't read all the systems. They never quite align. So it's getting all of the systems ready as well. And so, that's a project on its own, but it's an arm of the wider what do we need to do work. And this is where pulling in the wider business, having those focus groups so that you've early identified who are going to be your key folk to make sure that all of this is going to work and work really well.
Perfect. Thank you, Sally. Kind of with that in mind, let's loop back to the legal angle for a moment. So Daniela, if a job description is inaccurate or outdated, where does the legal responsibility sit?
So in the sense of having the right documentation as an employer, there's an expectation that the employer will have the most up-to-date job descriptions, etc., just on a day-to-day employee relations piece. If we've gone fast forward and we're at the stage where we're in litigation, the burden of proof actually, certainly from a UK perspective, so if we use that as an example, the burden of proof to establish whether a role is of equal value to another role is actually with the individual seeking to bring the claim. So it sits with the claimant. So the claimant has to prove that their role is of equal value to another role. Actually, and then it's only when they've established that their role is of equal value that the burden of proof shifts to the employer to justify, if they're not paid the same and they're of the opposite sex, why they're not paid the same. So you've then got to come up with that objective reason that we pay you differently, but it's not for a reason related to gender. And that's how an equal pay claim based on equal value manifests itself. So there's almost two answers, but I'm not trying to be, there's no point in being clever and smart about it and go, okay, we can have rubbish, out of date job descriptions because, haha, if you ever get to litigation, the burden rests with you, claimant, to prove. That's just ridiculous. It's not practical. That's the legal answer. But the answer to your question is, quite frankly, it's up to the employer. The expectation will sit with the employer to have robust, to use Sally's word, job descriptions, insofar as you are able, that accurately reflect, insofar as possible. You'll never capture everything, but that they are as accurate as they can be, to reflect the role that job holder is doing. And remember, it's the role. The job description reflects the role. It doesn't reflect the individual. It's the role that the job description is meant to relate to. It's not meant to be tailored for whoever's in that role at a particular time. It's the role, because that's what you're meant to be paying for. You're paying for the role, and then you get tweaks around someone's particular skill set and so on and so forth, which might dictate where they sit on a range, for example. But fundamentally, it's the role that job description needs to relate. So it sits with the employer, and that's when, as part of this whole exercise, it's a good time to just dust off those job descriptions and look at your processes and procedures and just see, look, what is our house built on? Have we got a robust structure, or actually is everything really out of date and doesn't actually reflect the current state of our workforce at all? It's as good a time as any to be addressing that.
Perfect. And lastly, from yourself, Daniela, when organisations rely heavily on that unwritten context or manager interpretation, does relying on the unwritten context or manager narratives increase legal risk? Yeah.
The worst possible thing that can happen in this scenario is the dreaded D word, discretion. Manager discretion is the biggest creator of risk in this area. That's why all of this directive is framed around, objective criteria, robust processes. It's meant to be consistent approach. There's no room for that discretion where, someone's mate and they get a promotion or whatever. All these little things that can creep in, and it is part of being a workforce at the end of the day. It's always going to happen. But fundamentally, when you're building a system in your organization, you need to build systems that avoid, wherever possible, any element of manager discretion. And that comes through having good policies and procedures and good training, making sure that, you can have a lovely policy, but if nobody knows what it says or how to implement it, it's not worth the paper it's written on. In fact, you're better off having no policy than a policy nobody follows. It's more risk. So it's just about having those processes and procedures in place to try and take out that room for interpretation, because when you get to litigation, in the absence of a written process, you're leaving it wide open for people to fill in their own narrative or fill in the gaps with whatever suits their case. So the more you can take away any ambiguity or discretion, the better from a risk perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daniela. Final sprint now. So I'll go back to Stuart. What advice would you give to employers as they prepare for the last few months before the regulations go live?
Yeah, I think make sure you're ready. And how do you define ready? Well, you're probably not waiting for the country-specific regulations. As we spoke about earlier, we're not quite sure when they're all going to land, and you need to make the most of the time that you've got left. I think when it comes to defining ready, we tend to think of it at sort of 4 different levels. There is the design and the technical readiness, if you like. Are the underlying reward frameworks and related people processes sort of compliant and documented? Have you gone through that exercise to, as Daniela said, identify and remove or put some really significant guardrails around areas where there's management discretion? these regulations have been called sort of the death of discretion in reward across Europe by a lot of different employers. And we've all, I suspect, in some point in our career, been part of, I don't know, an incentive plan where your line manager gets given a pot of money and divvies it up amongst the team as they see fit. That's got to go. You can't do that anymore moving forward. You've got to give some really clear, specific guardrails on how it's allocated. So there is the design part of being ready. Then following on from design, you've got the process piece. Have you worked out how you're going to deliver all of these requirements to the employees in an efficient, effective, compliant way? Because again, as we've spoken about, having one without the other is pretty pointless. So we need to make sure that we've got the process correct and is at the right time, and it's very clear and transparent process. Then we have something around sort of anomaly identification and management. So we can do some of the analytics, we can dive into some of the detail and work out where we've got issues and start to address them. And then finally, if you like, the fourth part of being ready is, and we've already spoken about it, I think, Sally, you spoke about it a moment ago, is the communication and education side of it. Have you sort of taken employees and managers on the journey with you? Don't surprise them with this, please. They will get their information and education from other sources. It could be the works councils, it could be the media, if you're not telling them about it. And I can tell you right now, if they are relying on works councils or the media for their information, they will not get the level of understanding that you would want them to have. So please take ownership of that communication piece. A lot of employers, when they think about readiness, tend to focus just on one or two aspects of those sort of four. So again, do try and think about them as a whole. I need to come up with a snappy acronym for them, but do try and think about them as a whole. So it is the technical, the design piece, it is the process, it's the anomaly, and then it's the communication and education, and probably in that order as well. We do see some who dive straight into analytics and then realize that actually some of the underlying practices are not robust enough, and they have to go back and repeat the analytics once they've done some further design work.
And lastly, from you, Stuart, and brilliant, thank you so much. We can't ignore the impact of on employers in the UK. So what do the regulations mean for employers in the UK?
Yeah, I'm afraid technically they don't apply to us, but if you're sat here on this call thinking, okay, I've just joined so I understood what was going on elsewhere because these are not relevant to me, I've only got people in the UK, I might have some bad news for you. These are going to change practices and precedent here in the UK a lot over the coming year or two. Firstly, in Northern Ireland, we've got the situation where actually, because of the Windsor Framework Agreement, you're likely to have to follow the Irish regulations on this. There is a requirement under the Brexit deal that we signed that Northern Ireland follows Ireland on this sort of thing. So if you have employees sat in the Northern Irish market and not anywhere else in the EU, you will still need to comply, is the current advice that we are giving to employers in that area. Secondly, EU employers across the region all seem to be saying something very, very similar, which is the fact that they're not likely to differentiate practices wildly in non-EU markets in Europe. So what that means is they're going to be applying probably 90% of their new Brave transparency processes. They will be applying those to the UK market as well. There's lots of different reasons why they sort of say they're going to do that. One, they're worried that if they don't do it, it's going to undermine their kind of global or international brand. It will add a lot of complexity for them. At some level, they will have a manager, a leader, who has a team in the UK and a team, I don't know, in France or in Germany. And are you seriously going to say to that line manager, you can tell this group that information, but not that group? It's just not practical. It would become too complex very quickly. It could create some employee resentment when employees talk, they mingle, they have conversations with each other. And if you have someone saying, oh, we've just been told all of this, and someone sat in the UK going, well, we haven't had any of that. What's going on? What are they hiding from us? And finally, it makes international mobility, which a lot of organizations now really value. If you don't have a similar set of practices across the region, it's going to make that really complex. Finally, we know that the UK is looking at pay equality, pay transparency as well. We had a government consultation on that take place over the summer. It's clearly on the agenda, and I suspect it's just a matter of time before we get some similar requirements here. So the advice is kind of make no mistake, transparency is coming to the UK. Practices will change over the course of the next year as EU employers roll out those practices across the EU anyway. And if you want to recruit, retain your people, you need to be giving them transparency. Transparency attracts, secrecy doesn't sell. So you really need to make sure you're following that and keeping ahead of the curve on that one. And as I say, it's just a matter of time before the UK goes down a similar pathway.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Stuart. To bring the people impact to life, Sally, let's go back to you for a final question. Can you share an example where greater transparency led to an unexpected benefit or benefits or challenges internally?
I think one of the biggest surprises, and I'm saying surprises, I've put it in inverted commas because it shouldn't surprise when you're talking about communication or lack of, but organisations that I've been working with and talking to that are going through this process, they've said, oh my goodness, actually, by communicating out with our leaders, all of a sudden we're understanding more what's going on across the business. So that's made us actually have a clearer communication strategy linked to our pay strategy. And, it does always surprise me that, if you don't talk to somebody, how do you expect them to know something? And from that, the feedback has been that because we are we've changed how we approach communication, we've seen a real positive impact on, the trust, the culture. There's more, people seem to be, living the values and the culture better and more. And we've seen a change in attrition rates as well. We haven't got as many folk leaving because they like the brand. They understand, well, actually, I've got an organisation who are open and transparent, and this is where I want to work. So I think as a real positive, and there's still that, there's an absolute shed load of work to be done for many organisations to be ready. But one of the real positive outcomes of this has been how communication has just improved, dramatically improved. And those open conversations around pay, and also because of documenting the process, it made me chuckle when Danielle said about sort of discretion and managers, and they should never be in the same sentence. Well, around pay anyway. And so it is managers are starting to feel emboldened because they have the tools. They understand what it is they have to do. They're not just sort of given, here's your budget, spend it wisely. But if you don't spend it wisely, then just be ready for those awful conversations. So it's a sort of a multi-faceted positive outcome, I think, and which is fabulous.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sally. So that is perfectly timed as well. We've got a couple of minutes to spare. I want to thank the panelists, Daniela, Stuart and Sally for their insights and time. I think there's a lot of information to digest, and I hope that it's given clarity and momentum for much of you to take the next steps with some confidence. Because of how much detail and insight has gone into this, we are looking to run a secondary session, which will likely be in January. So we'll organise that, and we'll send out some information to everyone here today, and for those that have asked for the recording that haven't been able to make it live. So I'll get that through to everybody. But it's shaping up to be another practical session. I think we'll allow for more questions from the audience relating on where you're at now and some of the insights and steps you've taken from the session today. If you would like a copy of today's recording, please just reach out to me. I'll send that across to you. And lastly, if you're not a part of the Senior Reward Leaders community and want to get access to more events like this, then please reach out and I can share some further details on that. But from myself and JGA Recruitment, appreciate everyone attending. This is a massive topic. So hope you got a lot of value out of it, and we'll see you soon, and Merry Christmas.
Huge thank you to our panellists, Daniela McGuigan, Stuart Hyland, John Diamond, and Sally Elcombe, and of course, our great host, Lewis Roskilly, who does indeed head up our reward division here at JGA Recruitment. So if you're watching this and you have any particular requirements that maybe we can help on the reward side, reward analysts, reward directors or beyond, please do get in touch with Lewis in my team at JGA Recruitment. You can get them at lewis@jgarecruitment.com. And thanks to all our panel members, of course, for sharing such clear, practical and forward-thinking insights about the EU Pay Transparency Directive. As you've heard today, the directive represents one of the most significant shifts in pay governance and workforce reporting we've seen in years. The perspectives shared here are going to help organizations at every single stage of readiness navigate what's coming next. Now, if you did find this discussion valuable, please do follow the show. Let us know on YouTube. Leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. Most importantly, share this episode with your payroll, with your reward, and with your HR colleagues. It really helps us raise the profile of payroll and reward. It helps us bring more high-impact conversations to the profession. It's just basically a great thing to do to bring more listeners to all of this great content and to all of our wonderful speakers. You'll find all the relevant links, resources, and future event information in the show notes. But for now, thanks for listening to the Payroll Podcast, and I'll see you on the next episode real soon. Thank you. What does global payroll without borders actually look like in real life? It's one platform handling every country you operate in. Real-time insights, automated tax logic, and zero handoffs between HR, IT, finance, or local vendors. That's exactly what happens when payroll runs on Deal's own global infrastructure. It's faster, it's cleaner, and built for teams that need accuracy every single time. See it for yourself at deel.com/Nick Day.